feels like there's a shift in consciousness. Change, the president-elect insisted, had come. A promise that left his lips 389 years after the first Africans had arrived in chains in the land that would become the British colonies. 151 years after the nation's highest court ruled that Dred Scott, an enslaved man attempting to sue for his freedom, had no standing to bring a suit because in the eyes of the law, he was property and not a person. And 143 years since the conclusion of the Civil War that had cleaved the country in two and left more than 500,000 dead. Obama launched his audacious campaign for the White House in the name of common hopes and common dreams in February 2007 in Springfield, Illinois, a site dripping with history. Springfield was Abraham Lincoln's hometown, and it was where, a century earlier, a white mob had burned black homes and businesses, leaving 7 people dead and hundreds injured. Violence that, in turn, helped spark the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, a leading voice in opposition to the racial terrorism of Jim Crow-era lynchings and an advocacy for full black citizenship and suffrage. Now, 21 months later, Obama assured a nation crafted from the clay of inequity that it had finally eradicated the injustice upon which it had laid its foundation. A country built on the subjugation of black people had now voted to place a black man in its highest office. As author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates would later write, Obama appealed to a belief in innocence, in particular white innocence, that ascribed the country's historical errors more to misunderstanding than to any deliberate malevolence or widespread racism. This appeal attracted people because it allowed them to feel that America was good. On MSNBC, legendary anchorman Tom Brokaw deemed Obama's election a profoundly important passage out of the deep shadows of our racist past that began with that first slave offloaded on a ship. The momentousness resonated around the world. Cable news split screens showed jubilant crowds filling the streets of the small Kenyan farming village where Obama's father had been born. Obama, racial barrier falls in decisive victory, the New York Times would declare on its front page the following morning. So what the hell happened? Because it's clear, with the benefit of even a decade of historical hindsight, that the election of a black president did not usher us from the shadows of our racist past. Rather, it led us down a perilous path and into a decade and a half and counting of explicit racial thrashing. The years that followed Obama's election would see 2 long-simmering racial movements burst to the fore of mainstream politics. The first of these was a nativist movement of white Americans that questioned the validity of the president's citizenship, his Christian faith, and his fidelity to America itself. For his 8 years in office, Obama would have no more consistent and persistent foe. This opposition was fanned by leaders on the political right, many of them media figures, some of them elected officials, who preached a politics of racial agitation, fear of immigrants and Muslims, contempt for black public figures and elected officials, and rebellion against government attempts to address racial inequalities. This movement wielded inflammatory rhetoric to appeal to the real fear held by many Americans of varying political affiliations that the country had irreversibly changed in ways that left them unheard and underserved, exposed and vulnerable. The Obama years were an era in which the murderous brutality of the Islamic terrorist network ISIS had renewed for many their post-9/11 concerns about Muslim terrorism. New census forecasts had many Americans imagining fundamental demographic changes to the face and feel of their nation. The passage of the Affordable Care Act represented a crushing blow to the small government conservatives who, since Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted the New Deal in the 1930s to dig the United States out of the Great Depression, had argued that the expansion of federal government services represented a march towards socialist doom. President George W. Bush's tax cuts and the Obama bank bailouts had left many working-class Americans across the political spectrum convinced that the system was rigged against them and that they had been left behind. Decades of activism resulted